Jericho Ridge baked under the weight of a punishing July sun, its dust rising like ghosts from a past nobody dared speak of. Tucked between the cliffs like a forgotten whisper, the town sat slouched, bone-dry and blistered, the wooden buildings leaning as if they too were tired of surviving. The land gave little. Cattle grazed what sparse grass the wind hadn't carried off, and the well in the center of town groaned more than it poured. Life here didn't bloom, it endured. And the people who stayed? They were made of grit, silence, and the kind of pride that cracked like old leather. Old Silas Boone moved through town like wind through brittle grass, soft, quiet, often unnoticed. He walked with a limp that twisted his right boot sideways, and a back that had grown used to pain long ago. His beard was long and white, tangled like forgotten rope, and his eyes, when anyone met them, were clear but distant, as if he were always listening to something nobody else could hear. Folks said he'd been in some war, maybe a dozen, but he never confirmed it. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't even raise his voice. He just worked that little patch of hard earth he called a ranch, out past the northern ridge, where the wind always howled at night. With him lived Clara Bell, a young woman with chestnut hair always tied back in a ribbon, eyes sharp as a hawk's, and hands tougher than most men's. She wasn't his kin, but he raised her like blood, since the fever took her folks when she was 9. She could ride, mend fence, and shoot straighter than half the deputies that had come and gone in town. But it wasn't her skill that made people take notice. It was her fire. Kind, yes. Gentle sometimes. But she was the sort who'd look a man square in the eye if he tried to tell her the world wasn't hers to walk through. Most respected her. Some didn't. It was just past noon when the 5 of them rode in. Dust swirled behind their horses like smoke from a fire that hadn't started yet. Their leader rode up front, tall and broad, his face carved with cruel lines and a grin that never reached his eyes. Cass Harlan. Folks didn't say his name much anymore, not since the incident in Tombstone, where 3 men ended up face down in a ditch after calling him a cheat. Behind him came 4 more, young, loud, and hungry, the kind that laugh when something bleeds. They reined in outside the saloon. No one said a word. Chairs scraped back, curtains twitched, and the town held its breath. Cass stepped down slow, spurs ringing on the boards like the ticking of a pocket watch. His coat was dust-dark, fringed with road wear and blood at the edges, and when he pushed open the saloon doors, the heat followed him in like a shadow. Clara happened to be walking across the street, arms full with a bundle of feed sacks, headed toward the supply shed. Cass's eyes tracked her the way wolves do. He nudged one of his men with his chin. The boy, no more than 20, with a scar curling over his eyebrow, let out a low whistle. Silas watched from the far end of the street, sitting by the blacksmith's trough, carving something small from a chunk of mesquite wood. His knife didn't pause, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Looks like Jericho Ridge owes some back dues," Cass said loudly, stepping into the shade of the saloon overhang. Town got quiet. "Don't tell me y'all forgot our arrangement." No one answered. Cass's boots thudded across the porch and down the steps. He approached Clara, who hadn't slowed her pace, but hadn't looked at him either. "Well, well," he said, stepping into her path. "Didn't know the ridge grew roses in the dust." She looked up at him, jaw set. "Step aside." He smiled, full of teeth and threat. "That's no way to greet visitors. Tell me, are all the girls in this town so?" His hand reached out, quick as a whip, brushing her sleeve, just enough to make her stop cold. Before she could react, one of the younger outlaws said something lewd and stepped in closer. The other laughed. It was ugly laughter, the kind that echoed even after it stopped. Cass raised his hand. Now, boys. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Then, like a snake bite, his hand came down, not hard enough to knock her down, but fast, disrespectful, stinging against her cheek. The sacks dropped. Clara stumbled back a half step, her hand on her face, but her eyes burned with a fury that silenced the street more than the slap had. A chair creaked behind them. Silas Boone stood. He didn't shout, didn't rush, just walked slowly down the street, each step kicking up a puff of dust. The knife was still in his hand, half-finished carving tucked in his shirt pocket. His eyes were on Cass. Not angry, not afraid, Just certain. Cass turned, amused. Well, look who rose from the dead. Silas stopped a few feet away, squinting against the sun. Let her be. Cass laughed and spread his arms. Or what, old man? You'll limp me to death. The other outlaws hooted. Silas didn't blink. I said, let her be. Cass stepped forward. Tell you what, why don't you shuffle on back to your porch and rock yourself to sleep? This here's men's business. Silas moved. No one saw how. 1 second he was standing still. The next, the young outlaw to Cass's right was on his knees, clutching a dislocated shoulder. Another was doubled over, wheezing for air. Cass spun, reaching for his gun, but Silas had already closed the space between them. He twisted Cass's wrist in a flash, dropping the revolver, then flipped him onto his back with a grunt that shook the dust from the porch roof. In seconds, Silas had 2 of them hogtied with the straps from the fallen feed sacks. Another tried to draw, but Clara had picked up Silas's knife and hurled it, burying it deep in the post an inch from the man's head. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It thrummed. Alive. Cass lay there, dazed, arms pinned, his cheek in the dirt where Clara's had just stung. Silas looked down at him, expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he slapped Cass across the face. Once. Clean. Loud. The townsfolk gasped. Some stepped out from behind door frames. Others looked at each other in awe. Silas helped Clara gather the fallen sacks. She nodded once, her hand still on her cheek, but her eyes glimmered. They walked away together, back toward the ridge. Cass lay there, face burning hotter than the sun, the sting on his skin not nearly as deep as the wound to his pride. Behind them, whispers started. Did you see? Old Silas. No, that wasn't just a ranch hand. And in the distance, where the canyon wind howled through dead brush and broken rock, the dust carried a new story, one worth remembering, one just beginning. The sun had sunk low, casting Jericho Ridge in a copper haze, long shadows stretching like claws across the dusty street. Heat shimmered above the ground, thick as breath in a prayer, and the silence hung brittle in the air. Clara Bell stood alone by the water pump, drawing slow, measured strokes with the handle, her back straight, eyes forward. She'd known they would come back. Cass Harlan and his men hadn't ridden far that morning. Pride like his couldn't sit idle, with blood boiling under the skin and laughter still echoing in his ears. Being thrown in the dirt by an old man in front of the whole town, he would have taken a bullet easier. Now they rode back with teeth bared and tempers coiled tight. Clara heard the hooves before she saw them. 5 of them again, though one held his shoulder stiff, and another's hand was wrapped in a torn piece of shirt. Cass rode at the front, face calm, but eyes lit with the kind of anger that only grows in silence. He dismounted slow, almost lazy, boots tapping the hard ground like a death march. She didn't flinch. That only fueled men like him. Well now, he drawled, dusting his coat sleeves. Look what we found. Pretty girl all alone. Shame about that temper of yours earlier. One of the younger men laughed, a short, mean sound. Clara didn't answer. She kept pumping water, letting it splash over the rusted bucket, her jaw tight. Cass stepped closer. You see, there's a way things are done in places like this. You get put in your place once, and you stay there. He reached forward. Fingers brushed the side of her skirt. She slapped his hand away. Touch me again, and you'll be drawing breath through a straw. Cass chuckled. You talk like you got teeth, girl, but I think you're just bark. Behind him, his men fanned out in a semicircle, hands near their hips, smirks on their lips. One of them reached toward Clara's shoulder, catching a bit of her dress, tugging just enough to make her stumble back. The fabric tore slightly at the seam. The bucket clattered to the ground. A few townspeople across the street watched from their windows, their eyes half hidden behind curtains. The sheriff, old and shaky, stood by his office door and said nothing. Fear was thick in the air, and it tasted like dust and shame. Then the worst of it came. Cass raised his hand and struck her. The crack of it echoed like a rifle shot across the square. Clara's head snapped sideways, her body trembling from the sudden shock, a red print blooming on her cheek like wildfire. And still no one moved. Except one. Silas Boone stood beneath the rusted arch of the livery stable, leaning on a broken hitch rail, a loop of weathered reins in one hand, whittling knife in the other. He had watched it all, unmoving, a shadow inside the heat haze. His hat was pulled low, eyes hidden, but his stillness was loud in a way only true danger ever is. Cass turned his head slowly toward him, sneering. "What, you again? Thought you'd done your one miracle for the decade." Silas stepped out, slow and easy. The limp was real, but the steps carried weight now, deliberate and measured like a fuse burning down. He stopped 10 paces from Clara, who stood rigid, eyes locked on him. "Let her go," Silas said, voice dry as gravel and just as steady. One of the outlaws chuckled. "Old man, sit down for your bones turn to dust." Cass spat in the dirt. "You know what I think. I think maybe we take your little ranch next. You and the girl can share a grave." The others laughed. Silas didn't answer. He simply moved. The motion was a blur, too fast, too smooth for a man his age. Before any of them could blink, the reins in his hand whipped out and coiled around the wrist of the nearest outlaw, yanking him forward with such force he lost his footing and slammed into the dirt. A second later, Silas pivoted and drove an elbow into the second man's throat, dropping him with a grunt and a gasp. One man reached for his gun. Silas was there before the iron cleared leather, twisting the man's arm backward until bone popped like firewood, the scream cutting through the street like a broken fiddle string. The revolver dropped harmlessly at Clara's feet. Then came Cass. He lunged, knife drawn, fury replacing arrogance, the kind of rage born of humiliation. But Silas stepped inside the arc, used his body's weight to spin Cass around, and wrapped the broken reins tight across the outlaw's throat, dragging him backward. Cass clawed and thrashed, but Silas didn't flinch. He yanked the man off his feet and slammed him into the water pump post, the wooden beam shaking under the force. It took seconds, just seconds. Cass coughed, breath shallow, pinned like a hog for branding. Silas held him there with one arm while unhooking a length of leather from the saddle of a fallen horse. With practiced hands, he tied Cass's wrists behind him, then looped the leather around one of the other groaning outlaws, knotting it so tight the young man whimpered. Then he turned to Clara. Her cheek was red, her chest heaving, but her eyes had never left him. Not once. He took her by the arm gently and began walking her away, leaving behind a tangle of broken pride and bound men. No words passed between them, not until they were nearly out of earshot of the square. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Silas didn't stop walking. "Yes, I did." Behind them, the silence broke, first with gasps, then murmurs, and soon, the buzz of voices rising in disbelief. "Did you see what he took him down like there was nothing. That old man." The story spread like wildfire through dry brush, from the saloon to the mill, from front porches to bunkhouses. Folks who'd looked at Silas Boone like a weathered shadow now stared as if seeing him for the first time. Not just a ranch hand, not just a crippled old loner. Something else entirely. Something dangerous. Legendary. "Old Silas ain't who we thought," someone muttered. And in Jericho Ridge, that sentence was enough to change everything. The stars hung low over Jericho Ridge that night, bright as broken glass scattered across black velvet. Crickets sang a steady hymn beneath the hush of the wind, but the town itself was quiet, wrapped in the kind of silence that settles only after something irreversible. Clara sat on the porch of the ranch house, arms folded, a thin wool blanket around her shoulders. Though the summer air was still warm, her cheeks still carried the fading mark of Cass Harlan's slap. But it wasn't the sting of that moment that kept her jaw tight. It was the man sitting inside, rocking gently in his chair like nothing had happened. She pushed open the door. Silas looked up. His hat hung on a peg beside him, his boots off, feet crossed at the ankle. He was rubbing liniment into the gnarled scar on his left hand, the one he usually kept hidden under a glove. "You ain't who I thought," Clara said. He didn't answer. She stepped further in, eyes not blinking. "You moved like you'd done it 100 times before. Like it wasn't even hard." Still, he said nothing, just finished rubbing the ointment and leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking beneath him like it had secrets too. Clara's voice dropped. "Who are you?" Silas's eyes lifted to hers, clear and sharp, but weary. Not tired from age, but from carrying something too long. He gestured toward the fire. "Sit. You'll want to hear it all." She didn't sit, but she didn't leave either. He stared at the flames a long moment, then began. "Before this place, before you, there was another life. I was called Captain Silas Boone back then. Rode under a black banner, with a star and a warrant. They called me a frontier scout. Some said bounty hunter. Others called me worse. Most folks just knew me by a name I never asked for." He paused, mouth tightening. "The Hangman of Dry River." Clara sucked in a breath. The name wasn't unknown. She'd heard it once, whispered between cowhands like a ghost story, about a man who tracked outlaws into canyons no one returned from, who brought them back either bound or buried. A man whose justice never waited on courtrooms. "I was good at it," Silas said, eyes heavy. "Too good. Got to believing maybe justice meant doing whatever it took, no matter who got caught in the crossfire." He shifted forward in the chair, hands clasped. "Then one night, while I was gone tracking a gang south of Santa Fe, raiders came to my land. Thought I wasn't there. Thought they could take what they wanted. My wife, Annalie, and our boy, James, they didn't stand a chance." The silence was louder than any gunshot. Clara's throat closed, her breath caught. "When I came back," Silas continued, "I found smoke and blood and nothing worth saving. I buried him with my own hands. And I walked away from the badge, the bounty, the name. Rode north till the horses couldn't carry my grief any farther. Then I found you." Her knees bent, and she finally sat, slowly, like the air itself had grown heavier. "You never told me." "No," he said softly. "Didn't see what good it would do. I figured I'd hang up the ghosts and live quiet. You gave me reason to." Outside, a wind picked up across the plains. The window rattled in its frame. "But ghosts don't stay buried," Silas murmured, staring out into the dark. "Sometimes they ride in wearing other men's faces." Miles outside town, deep in a grove of black pines, Cass Harlan nursed a bottle of whiskey and the bruises on his pride. The fire danced wild across his face, making his eyes shine with hatred. Around him, his wounded men grumbled, licking their injuries. The youngest was gone, rode off as soon as the sun dipped below the ridge, muttering something about curses and devils wearing skin. Cass didn't stop him. He was already sending word to the men who mattered. Grady Nix, Tom Cutter, Black Jeb with the gold tooth, and the snake tattooed on his neck. Old riding partners from the worst days. He'd buried enough silver to pay them all and promised more if they helped him tear Jericho Ridge off the map. "Before dawn," Cass hissed into the flames. "Before the rooster crows, that bastard's gonna be cold. And that girl, she's gonna watch." Back at the ranch, Silas stood in the dark barn, lantern casting long shadows across weathered beams and old tack. He lifted the floorboard beneath the third stall and pulled free a long-forgotten chest. The wood groaned as he opened it. Inside lay the bones of his old self. A sawed-off Spencer rifle, cleaned and oiled, wrapped in worn flannel. A Bowie knife with a staghorn grip, its edge still gleaming with hunger. A leather satchel filled with cartridges and a rolled-up parchment. Hand-drawn maps of every canyon, trail, and escape route for 50 miles in all directions, inked with symbols and marks only Silas understood. He laid them out with reverence, like a priest preparing for communion. No joy, no excitement, just duty. Clara stood at the door of the barn, watching. "You're going after them," she said. "They're coming here," he corrected. "But I'll meet them on the way." She stepped forward. "You shouldn't have to fight alone." He looked up. "I already lost one family. I won't lose another." She didn't argue, but her eyes glistened in the lantern light. She'd seen many sides of the man who raised her, gentle, stern, tired, proud. But never this, the soldier under the skin, stepping back into his war. As the sky turned a deeper shade of blue, Silas rode into town. The streets were empty but not asleep. Lights flickered behind shuttered windows. People were awake, whispering, waiting. He dismounted outside the sheriff's office, walked up the steps, and pushed the door open without knocking. Sheriff Amos Caldwell sat behind his desk, gun laid out, hand shaking. "I saw what you did to those boys," he said. "If there's more coming, I can help." Silas shook his head. "Lock the doors, Amos. Keep your people inside." Amos frowned. "You can't take them alone." "I ain't planning to take them," Silas said. "I'm planning to stop them." The sheriff looked down at the old man's boots, then back up at his eyes. "You're not what I thought." Silas gave the faintest nod. "No one ever is." And with that, he stepped back into the street, rifle across his shoulder, coat fluttering in the rising breeze. Overhead, the moon climbed higher, full and pale, casting silver on the dust. Jericho Ridge slept uneasy, wrapped in old myths and new fear, unaware that by morning, the earth itself might remember a name long buried. The hangman of Dry River had risen. The first light of morning stretched across Jericho Ridge like a knife's edge, slicing through the darkness with pale gold. The sun had not yet risen fully, but the horizon burned crimson, as if the sky itself knew something wicked was coming. And it was. 15 riders moved in a loose line across the high plain, faces grim, guns heavy, and eyes sharp. Dust rose behind them in slow, curling plumes. At their head rode Cass Harlan, jaw clenched. The bruises on his face faded, but not forgotten. He rode like a man chasing vengeance. And this time, he wasn't alone. Below the ridge, Silas Boone crouched in the canyon mouth, wind brushing past his weathered face. His hands worked with quiet purpose, looping rope around a narrow boulder outcropping, anchoring a trip line across the trail. Farther up, under a cluster of mesquite, sticks of old dynamite, stolen years ago from a mining outfit, lay nestled behind dry brush, the fuse coiled like a rattlesnake. It wasn't elegant, but it would do. He moved like a ghost through the winding paths, remembering every bend, every rise, every echoing chamber of the canyon. These trails had been his hunting ground once. They still knew his name. He hit a second charge under a false pile of stones near a bend where sound played tricks. Then a third, low in a gully, just beneath a patch of rock that looked stable but wasn't. His hands were steady, his breath even. He wasn't angry. He was focused, sharp and cold, like the edge of a knife strapped to his thigh. The memories came in flashes, not like hauntings, but like old instructions, movements etched in blood and dirt and sorrow. He remembered the way Annalie had once laughed as she tied her hair back, standing on the porch, the way little James had tripped running through the tall grass, brushing the dust off like it didn't matter. He remembered the fire that had eaten them whole, the silence that followed, and then the man he became. His boots found the old snipers, perch above Hanging Rock Basin, where he'd once waited 3 days for a killer named Dutch Rowe to ride in. That day, he'd fired 1 shot. It had been enough. Now he waited again. The first explosion cracked the sky open like thunder, sending birds screaming from the trees. A horse whinnied. Men shouted, panic tearing through their ranks. One rider went down hard, the trip line catching his mount mid-stride, flinging man and beast into the canyon wall. The others scattered, unsure where the next strike would come from. They didn't see Silas, but he saw them. One by one, they entered his gauntlet. He moved through them like a storm wearing skin, striking fast, vanishing faster. A rifle blast from above, a blade slashing from behind a rock, a shadow slipping between ledges. His traps didn't kill them all, but they broke formation, broke confidence. The canyon wasn't theirs. It belonged to the past, and the past belonged to Silas Boone. But Cass wasn't leading the charge anymore. He'd ridden a separate path, veering off beneath the southern ridge with 2 of his fastest men. While the others were being hunted, he crept around the backside of the ranch. Clara never had time to scream. They found her near the well, loading buckets, just like always. The struggle was short. She fought, she bled, but they outnumbered her. When Silas returned to the ranch to reload and regroup, he found only a single boot, a smear of blood, and a note nailed to the barn door. Come to Hanging Rock, or she dies screaming. The sky was blazing now, the sun burning straight above the bluff like a fiery eye. Heat shimmered across the dirt as Silas rode out alone. No traps this time, no rifle, Just the sawed-off tucked into the back of his belt, the Bowie knife on his hip, and a look on his face like stone warmed in hellfire. He found them in the basin, Cass standing tall, smirking, one hand tangled in Clara's hair. Her lip was split, but she was breathing. Her hands were tied, her spirit not. "Took you long enough," Cass called, voice echoing through the dry bowl of land. "Thought maybe your bones finally gave out." Silas dismounted slow, said nothing. Cass shoved Clara aside and stepped forward, dropped the weapons. Silas let the shotgun clatter to the ground, the knife too. He drew it out, slow and quiet, and dropped it beside the shotgun. Cass grinned. "There. Now it's just you and me." The circle formed, loose and wide, made up of the outlaws who remained, wounded, limping, but still hungry to see blood. Silas stepped into the center, shoulders straight, arms open. Cass came fast. The first blow landed hard, a right hook to Silas's cheek that knocked him sideways. He staggered but didn't fall. Another punch, this time to the ribs. Then a knee. Another punch. The sound of it echoed like the thud of meat dropped in the dust. Silas didn't lift his arms. He took every hit, eyes focused only on Clara, on the way her eyes widened with each blow, on the single tear that broke loose down her bruised cheek. Cass raised both fists, drunk on the sight of it. "You were never a legend," he spat. "Just an old cripple playing cowboy." Then Silas moved, like a serpent uncoiled. His fist shot forward just once, straight into Cass's gut, folding the man in half. He followed it with an elbow to the jaw, then a foot sweep that slammed Cass onto his back with a grunt that stole the wind from the onlookers. The old man knelt on his chest, twisted his arm behind him until it cracked loud enough to make one man vomit. Cass screamed. Silas didn't stop. He leaned close, voice low but clear, cutting through the heat and the dust like gospel. "You thought I was broken," he said, his breath even, his hand steady. "Turns out I was just resting." Cass howled beneath him. "Beg," Silas said. "What?" Silas twisted. "Beg." Cass's teeth gnashed. He growled like an animal, then, finally, choked out the words. "Please stop." Silas stood slowly, straightened his back, and looked out at the circle of riders. No one moved. No one drew. No one dared. "You want revenge," he said, voice raised now. "You bring it. But you leave this town, this girl, and every inch of land she walks on alone. Or next time, I don't stop with a broken arm." No one answered. Clara pushed herself to her feet, wobbled, then found Silas's shoulder. He steadied her, and together they walked away. The wind blew up behind them, pulling dust across the basin, erasing their tracks like the past being buried once more. But the name Silas Boone no longer lived in shadows. It lived in whispers, in firelight stories, in the memory of 15 riders who came to conquer and left afraid to draw breath too loud. The hangman had slapped back, and Jericho Ridge would never be the same. The sun was low and heavy, casting long amber streaks across the hills as if the land itself were exhaling after the storm. Inside the little ranch house on the northern edge of Jericho Ridge, the world had grown quiet again, save for the slow trickle of water and Clara's breath as she dabbed blood from Silas's brow. He sat still as a carving, eyes half closed, a gash above his temple and bruises blooming along his ribs like blue flowers after rain. "You're lucky your bones didn't give out," she muttered, rinsing the cloth again. He didn't answer, just gave a faint chuckle, more from his chest than his mouth. "Lucky never had much to do with it," he said. She shook her head. "You're insane. Brave but insane." Silas opened one eye. "You sound like your mother." Clara paused. A moment passed between them, soft, heavy, filled with all the things they didn't say. The warmth of the fire flickered across the wooden walls, dancing shadows playing around the room, like memories in motion. Silas stared into it as if he could see something no one else could anymore. Not regret, not grief, just peace. A strange kind of stillness he hadn't known in decades. Outside, the town moved differently now. Men who once looked past him now tipped their hats without a word. Women glanced out their windows a little longer. Children whispered as he passed, wide-eyed and curious. Stories had already started. Some said he could move like lightning. Others claimed he'd fought off a whole gang with only his hands and a stare that stopped bullets. The truth didn't matter anymore. Legends had taken root. The next morning, the sheriff came with a leather badge in hand, silver star gleaming under the cloudless sky. He stood at the gate for a long moment, waiting for Silas to meet him. "You kept this place from burning," Amos said. "More than I ever could. The town could use a man like you on the law." Silas looked down at the badge, then out across the land, where the wind moved through tall grass like ghost fingers. "I've done my duty," he said softly. "That part of me's buried now." The sheriff didn't argue. He only nodded, tucked the badge back into his pocket, and left the way he came. Weeks passed, then months. Clara took over the ranch with a quiet pride that made the neighbors respect her more than any man who'd ever owned land in the ridge. She patched fences, broke colts, hired 2 ranch hands, and ran the place like her blood ran through its roots. The town saw her not just as Silas's girl, but as her own storm and shelter. As for Silas, he spent more time under the porch roof, whittling scraps of wood into little totems. Hawks, wolves, a horse mid-gallop. He never explained them, never sold them, just gave them away to whoever needed them most. Quiet boys with bruised eyes, widows who missed their sons, ranchers who came home from war with ghosts in their mouths. At night, sometimes, the fire crackled loud, and Clara would find him standing by the edge of the hill, staring out toward the dark line of canyon that split the horizon, his face unreadable, his hat low, as if he were listening for something in the wind. She never interrupted. She knew what lived out there. The stories, though, they traveled. Campfires burned brighter when someone leaned forward and whispered, "You ever hear about the old man who tied the devil's hands?" And eyes would widen, heads would nod, and the tale would begin again, about a quiet rancher who was really a ghost from bloodier times, who saved a girl, a town, and then vanished like dust in the wind. No one ever told the story the same way twice. Some swore he rode with angels. Others said he'd once buried 6 men in 6 seconds. A few whispered he was cursed to wander forever, justice carved into his bones. But Clara knew better. He wasn't haunted. He was simply done. And then, one evening, he saddled his horse without a word. The sky was painted in violet and rust, the canyon glowing like it held fire in its throat. He wore the same coat he'd always worn, threadbare, stitched at the shoulder. The same boots, dusty and cracked. But his back was straight, and his eyes were clear. Clara watched from the gate, hands curled around the post. He tipped his hat to her. She didn't ask where he was going. She only nodded, as if she understood everything in that single moment. And then he turned, rode down the path alone, into the canyon's waiting mouth, the wind catching the brim of his hat and tugging his story loose. By the time the dust settled, he was gone, but the name remained, carved not in stone, but in silence, in memory, in the breathless space where fear once lived. Silas Boone, the old man who tied the devil's hands and walked away.